The alarm went off before Dale even finished his sentence, and that is the part nobody back on Earth ever believes when I tell this story. I am Priya Malhotra, xenoanthropologist aboard the research station Kestrel Vantage, and I have spent 6 years studying every strange and wonderful species the galaxy has to offer. I have watched silicate crystals sing to each other across open vacuum. I have translated the morning songs of gas giant dwellers who live 1,000 years and grieve for 100 of them, but nothing in my career prepared me for the sound of a full station lockdown triggered by the words "Hold my beer." It happened during the Zorvath trade delegation visit, 3 days into what was supposed to be a quiet, careful, diplomatically perfect week. The Zorvath are 11 feet tall, built from something like living stone, and they move and speak with the patience of glaciers. Their ambassador, a towering figure named Kalash, had flown 4 systems just to negotiate a mineral rights treaty with the Human Colonial Council. Everything about the visit had been planned to the second. Everything, except Dale Petrovski, our chief engineer, who nobody had thought to plan around, because nobody ever thinks to plan around Dale until it is far too late. We were at the welcome banquet in the station's main hall, a wide room with tall windows that looked out over the slow-turning stars. Ambassador Kalash sat at the head of the table, describing with great pride an ancient Zorvath custom called the Trial of Stillness, where their strongest warriors stand motionless inside a pressure chamber for 3 full days to prove their discipline and control. It was, by any measure, a beautiful and serious tradition, thousands of years old, spoken of with reverence. Dale, 3 drinks into the evening, leaned back in his chair, with the confident tilt of a man who has never once in his life read the rune correctly. He said, "We got something kind of like that." I felt the air change. Commander Reyes, seated 2 chairs down, went very still, the specific stillness of a person who has served with Dale long enough to recognize the exact tone of voice that precedes disaster. I had heard that tone before. Every human on this station had heard that tone before. It is a tone that sounds friendly and casual, and completely unaware of the storm it is about to summon. Ambassador Kalash turned toward him with slow, genuine curiosity, the stone plates of their face shifting the way Zorvath faces shift when they are interested rather than offended. They asked him to explain. Dale set down his drink, handed it to me without asking, which is how I ended up holding a half-finished glass of station-made cider as history unfolded around me, and he stood up from the table. He said, "You got your trial of stillness, real impressive, real disciplined. We got the opposite. We call it watch this." The lights in the hall flickered from warm white to a pale amber glow, and a low chime rang out across the entire station, the kind of chime you feel in your chest before you consciously register the sound. I want to explain, for anyone who has never lived on a concordance station, what that chime actually means. The concordance threat assessment grid is not a toy. It is not some silly overreaction dressed up as a joke. It was built after the Harrow conflict, a war that began with a single misunderstood phrase between 2 ambassadors, and ended with the loss of an entire moon colony. The grid was designed by the finest minds in 900 systems to detect the earliest signs of violence before it could ever begin. Watching tone of voice, posture, word choice, and crowd behavior across every inhabited station in concordant space, it has quietly prevented 3 wars that we know of. It is treated, by every serious government in the galaxy, as one of the most important pieces of technology ever built. And it has a special setting reserved entirely for us. I learned that night that station engineers across at least 4 different sectors have an informal nickname for this particular setting. They call it the Petrovski pattern. Officially, in the concordance records, it is listed as Threat Pattern 7, described in dry technical language as human verbal escalation immediately preceding unsupervised physical demonstration. The station's artificial mind, a calm and endlessly patient system we call PIP, spoke through the hall speakers in its usual even tone. It announced an elevated risk pattern, citing vocal stress markers, challenge-based sentence structure, and a rapid increase in nearby crowd attention, all consistent, it said, with an imminent unsafe activity. It informed us that the recreational deck was being placed under a precautionary lockdown until the situation could be assessed. Dale looked up at the ceiling as if the station itself had personally insulted him. He said, "This is exactly what I mean. I haven't even done anything yet." That, I told him, still holding his drink, is precisely the problem. Ambassador Kalash leaned forward across the table, and their low, grinding voice rose slightly in pitch, which I had come to recognize over 3 days as the Zorvath equivalent of excitement rather than concern. They asked whether the station itself was capable of anticipating the demonstration before it had even occurred. They found this fascinating. They wanted to know how a species could be flagged as dangerous before taking any action at all. Commander Reyes rubbed her temples and explained, in the tired voice of someone who has given this exact explanation many times before, that it was not really about the specific words. It was a learned linguistic pattern. Phrases like "hold my beer" or "watch this" or "I bet I can" had, across years of station data, shown an extremely high correlation with someone needing urgent medical attention within the following hour. The system had simply learned to take humans at their word, and humans, it turned out, rarely meant well by their own words. Dale, entirely undeterred by any of this, decided that the conversation had gone on long enough without a demonstration to back it up. There had been an old folding service cart left near the wall after dinner had been cleared, the kind with a round metal handle built into its side for pushing it through narrow corridors. Dale had, at some point in his youth, apparently learned the human party trick of folding his body through an unstrung tennis racket, and in the complete absence of a tennis racket on a research station in deep space, he decided the cart handle would serve just as well. It did not serve just as well. He did not fit through the handle. I want to be perfectly clear about that for anyone listening, because Dale has, on several later occasions, tried to claim that he nearly succeeded. He did not nearly succeed. He became thoroughly and immediately wedged, one arm and half his shoulder trapped through a metal loop never designed to hold the weight or shape of an adult man, while the amber lights continued to pulse gently overhead, and two small peacekeeping drones drifted closer, hovering at a distance that was polite but unmistakably ready to act if the situation required it. What followed was nearly 20 minutes of quiet chaos. Two of Dale's fellow engineers worked to free him using a bottle of cooking oil borrowed from the kitchen staff, while Ambassador Kalash sat calmly at the table, watching with what could only be described as scholarly delight, occasionally making notes on a small stone tablet they carried, which I later learned was titled, in careful Zorvath script, "Further Observations on the Human Species." The ambassador said this was remarkable, that our species appeared to have built an early warning system entirely against ourselves. Commander Reyes said flatly that we had needed to, because there were simply too many of us, and not nearly enough good sense to go around. The ambassador pressed further, asking why, if the danger was so well understood, nobody made any attempt to stop him. I told them that you do not stop the tide, you simply build strong medical bays and hope for the best. Eventually Dale worked free, smelling strongly of olive oil, and he raised one fist in triumph as though he had accomplished something impressive rather than narrowly avoiding a dislocated shoulder in front of a foreign dignitary. The amber lights faded back to their normal warm white, and Pip's calm voice returned, informing us that the threat level had been downgraded and that the incident was being logged, with a gentle recommendation that Engineer Petrovski's access to beverages be reviewed going forward. Dale told the ceiling, quite firmly, not to even think about it. Ambassador Kalash rose to their full height, and their stone plates clicked together in a slow rhythmic pattern I recognized by now as genuine laughter, a sound like wind moving through loose gravel. They announced to the entire table that they had come to this station prepared to negotiate mineral tariffs, and instead had witnessed a species so reckless that it required its own galaxy-grade alarm system, and yet somehow remained charming enough about the whole affair that they found themselves unable to look away. They proposed, on the spot, that the Zorvath Compact revise humanity's official threat classification from Category 4, listed simply as Erratic, to a new subcategory, Category 4H, listed as Erratic and Beloved. Commander Reyes put her face in her hands and asked the ambassador, quite sincerely, not to encourage him. It was, of course, too late. Dale had already spotted an old unstrung badminton net someone had left folded in the corner of the recreation deck, and he was halfway through asking whether anybody wanted to see if he could fit through that as well, before the amber lights returned, faster this time, as though the station itself had grown tired of pretending to give him the benefit of the doubt. I stopped being surprised by any of this a long time ago. I keep a private tally instead, a simple running count in a notebook I carry everywhere, and that evening the number climbed to 413. The next morning, Ambassador Kalash requested a private meeting with the human science staff, and I assumed, given the events of the previous night, that we were about to receive a formal complaint. Instead, the ambassador arrived with an entire delegation of junior Zorvath diplomats, all carrying their own small stone tablets, all eager to observe further. They explained, through their translator, that the trial of stillness had been performed by their people for over 6,000 years, and that in all that time it had never once triggered a single automated alarm on any station in concordant space. They found this, by comparison, somewhat boring. They wanted, quite openly, to see more of what they now called the human trial, which was apparently their new informal term for whatever Dale might attempt next. Commander Reyes tried, gently, to explain that this was not actually a tradition, that it was closer to an unfortunate habit, but the ambassador seemed unconvinced. They pointed out that any behavior repeated across an entire species, consistently, for as long as recorded human history could show, was by definition a tradition, whether or not the species itself wished to call it one. I found myself unable to argue with the logic, even though every part of me wanted to. Over the following 2 days, the delegation followed us with quiet, respectful interest, watching everything we did with the careful attention of scholars studying a particularly unpredictable weather pattern. They watched Dale attempt to balance a full tray of tools on one hand while climbing a maintenance ladder, an act which triggered a minor amber warning that resolved itself within seconds once he set the tray down without incident. They watched a young technician named Ellis try to prove he could hold his breath longer than the station's oxygen sensors would allow before flagging a medical concern, an attempt that ended with him gasping and laughing at the same time, while 2 crewmates pretended not to have made a small side wager on how long he would last. They watched, with visible fascination, an argument break out between 2 cooks over whose recipe for spiced flatbread was authentic, an argument that grew loud enough to trigger a brief amber flicker before dissolving into laughter, and an agreement to make both versions for dinner. By the 3rd day, the ambassador admitted, during a quiet conversation over morning tea, that they had begun to understand something about humanity they had not expected. They said that the Zorvath valued stillness because stillness, to them, represented mastery over fear. A being who could stand motionless for 3 days in a pressure chamber had proven that nothing could shake them, that they had conquered every instinct that might otherwise cause them to flinch or run or panic. I asked what they thought humans valued instead, since it was clearly not stillness. The ambassador considered this for a long moment before answering. They said that humans, as far as they could tell, valued the opposite, not the mastery of fear through stillness, but the mastery of fear through motion. Humans seemed to believe that trying something, even something reckless, even something likely to fail, was itself a kind of courage worth having, regardless of the outcome. They said this was, in its own strange way, just as disciplined as the trial of stillness, only expressed in the completely opposite direction. I told them that was a generous way of describing what I had personally witnessed as a man getting stuck in a metal cart handle. The ambassador's plates clicked together again in that gravel laughter, and they said that generosity of interpretation was, after all, the entire purpose of diplomacy. On the final evening of the delegation's visit, a farewell dinner was arranged in the same main hall where the whole strange series of events had begun. The mood was lighter this time, warmer, the tension of formal negotiation replaced by something closer to genuine friendliness. The mineral rights treaty had been signed that afternoon, favorable to both sides, and everyone seemed inclined to celebrate. It was during dessert that Ambassador Kalash stood, tapped their stone hand gently against their glass to draw attention, and announced that they wished to propose a toast, not to the treaty, but to what they called the spirit of the human trial. They said that in 6,000 years of Zorvath history, no visiting delegation had ever returned home with as many stories to tell as this one, and that for a diplomat, a good story was worth more than any treaty. Dale, predictably, looked delighted by this praise in a way that suggested he had learned absolutely nothing from the previous several days. The ambassador then turned to him directly and asked, with what I can only describe as genuine curiosity, whether there was one final demonstration he might wish to attempt before their ship departed in the morning, purely for the sake of scholarship. Commander Reyes, sensing exactly where this was headed, opened her mouth to intervene, but Dale was already standing, already grinning in that particular way that made every human at the table quietly brace themselves, and every drone in the ceiling quietly recalibrate. He said that he had, in fact, been saving one for a special occasion. He explained that back on Earth, in his hometown, there was an old tradition among engineers of his father's generation, a simple test of nerve involving 3 stacked chairs, a length of rope, and absolutely no safety equipment of any kind. I watched the amber lights begin to flicker before he had even finished describing what the rope was for. Pip's voice came through the speakers immediately, this time with what almost sounded like resignation woven into its usually neutral tone, announcing an elevated risk pattern and a precautionary lockdown of the immediate area. The peacekeeping drones drifted closer once more, and several of the junior Zorvath diplomats leaned forward eagerly, tablets ready, clearly hoping to witness one final chapter of human trial before their long journey home. Dale looked up at the ceiling, spread his arms wide in mock offense, and asked the station why it always assumed the worst of him before he had even touched the rope. Commander Reyes, without looking up from her dessert, said that the station had learned from experience, the same as the rest of us, and that experience was rarely wrong when it came to him specifically. The hall filled with laughter, human and Zorvath alike, a sound strange and mismatched and warm all at once, gravel chiming against easy human amusement. Ambassador Kalash raised their glass higher and declared that whatever happened next, successful or otherwise, would be recorded faithfully in the official delegation report, under a new heading they had personally created for the occasion, titled simply, Further Human Trials, Volume 2. I sat back in my chair, notebook already open on my lap, pen ready, and watched Dale begin arranging the 3 chairs with the focused seriousness of a man who had never once considered that some traditions exist for a reason, and that the reason was very often just to keep him away from rope. The amber lights held steady overhead, patient and unblinking, waiting. I did not close my notebook. I simply turned to a fresh page, and beneath the number 413, I wrote a new line, and waited, along with everyone else in that hall, along with the station itself, to see exactly how high that number was about to climb.